I'm Lori Petricchi of O'Reilly Media, and I'm here with Scott Murray, an assistant professor at the University of San Francisco. Hi, Scott.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
So I'd love to get your opinion on what web developers need to know and think about when they're faced with the idea of doing a visualization or thinking about user interface. You're an expert, so what can you tell them?
Yeah, so I like to work with visualizations. One of the challenges with visualizations is also what I think is what's most interesting about it to me is it's a really interdisciplinary practice. So you can't just learn the development tools for it, and you can't just learn kind of the design skills and the visual principles behind it. You sort of need to know all of those things, as well as understanding kind of how to work with data programmatically, and also from sort of an analytical perspective. So it makes it a very tricky question to answer because it's so interdisciplinary, and you have to sort of apply all these different skills to produce something that's works on the technical side, and then also works sort of perceptually, so people interpret the information the way you intended. There's not an easy answer to that question, but I think the important thing is to keep in mind there are all these different sort of facets at play, and you have to keep them all, kind of juggle them all at the same time.
Right, so where do you go to think about how do you make an intuitive interface? Because if you're a developer and you understand the structure and the tools and what you want to do, how do you add that next layer, whether it's a visualization layer or good experience for someone using your site?
Yeah, well, on the visualization side, like we have a lot of amazing resources kind of from the traditional print point of view. So obviously like Edward Tufte's books, Stephen Few's books, these are kind of established references on best practices for data graphics, sort of that data graphics world. Then what we sort of need to add into that is this awareness of user experience and interaction design. So how do we take kind of the best practices we have for a static graphic and figure out how to make those things move and how to make them respond to the mouse or on a tablet interface, something like that. So there's no, as far as I know, there's no sort of one definitive kind of resource where you can go to get that information, which to me is what makes the field exciting.
Right.
But it's also challenging for somebody wanting to get into it.
Yeah, where do they start?
Yeah, you can start kind of from the data viz end, or you can start from the UI, UX, human computer interaction end. Each of which those fields have like really great resources.
Okay, so mobile is so important today. So much information is consumed on your mobile phone, and it's my experience that a lot of the sites and the information I try to retrieve is difficult to find or use when I'm on my phone. And it seems to me that there needs to be a lot of work to create good experiences and visualizations on the mobile platform. So are you doing anything in that space, or do you have advice for people to how they can improve their mobile sites?
Yeah, so again, I could sort of talk separately about the visualization side and the general mobile UI, UX side. Visualization wise, this is why obviously I'm a big fan of D3, and the reason D3 is helpful in terms of mobile is because it's all built on these web standards, so no plugins required, it's all native browser technologies, which means on the technical level, if you write it and it works in a desktop browser, it's also going to work in a mobile browser. Now, separately, you have kind of the interface concerns, like, well, if I have a chart and it's this wide, is it going to make sense on a narrow little device? So that's where you have to sort of change your design approach. You can say, okay, on a technical level, I've made this chart or this map, and it works on a desktop device, but now I have to think about how can I make that graphic responsive? And if you're working with D3, you're probably using SVG. You don't have to, but it sort of works best with SVG as the graphical output format. And if you're using SVG, then you can use all these techniques that we already know from CSS. So you can use percentages instead of fixed pixel widths. So you could say, okay, make this graphic 100% of the width of the viewport. So on my desktop machine, it'll be this big. On my mobile device, it'll be this big. But I can have D3 sort of scale everything for me accordingly. And there's, depending on what you're doing, maybe that works. If it's just a plot of sort of like, this is a stock price going up and down, that's fine. If it's a more complex map or a more like kind of data-rich graphic, maybe it doesn't work to just make it narrower or make it smaller, right? There are other aspects of the design you have to account for. But in general, it's so much easier to do that with a tool like D3 and CSS, these things we're already familiar with, than going out and learning something totally new.
So SVG is a format that you would recommend? Are there other options based on what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, D3 wise, and in terms of like using web standards, avoiding plugins, supporting mobile, SVG is fantastic. It's sort of, I heard some great talks about SVG today actually at Fluent. It's great because it sort of exists within the DOM just like a normal HTML element, and so you can use JavaScript to manipulate it in the same way that you would manipulate any other part of the page. That's really different from JPEG or a GIF image, which is like a binary image format. So that exists in the web page as a box, but there's no way to sort of like manipulate individual elements within that box. Whereas SVG is also a box, like everything's a box to the browser. But within that you have circles and shapes and paths and text and all kinds of other things, and you can manipulate those the same way you would manipulate any of your user interface elements. So maybe I click a button and a modal window comes up and I hit OK and it disappears. So it's the same exact principles that we use in kind of interaction design on the web. You use those, but you're just applying them to graphical elements.
And those features allow for scalability for different screen sizes, is that correct?
Different screen sizes and super important different resolutions. So SVG is a vector-based format, so automatically if you create something with SVG that works on kind of a regular display, it'll look great on a Retina display or on a high definition display.
Or on your phone, right?
Or on your phone, yeah. Something really small, something really big. It scales really well. It's designed for that.
Right. So we've seen with SUV sort of a 2D environment, correct? And then we've seen a lot of interesting things coming out with 3D, especially with visualizations or different types of animation. Where do you see that going? Is that exploding now that we no longer need to use plugins or Flash?
Yeah, 3D, there's so much that we can do with 3D because it feels like it's only been a year or two that the current browsers have really been supporting WebGL. D3, it's very confusing. D3 and 3D, totally different things. D3 is the tool. People get them mixed up all the time, like on the email list and stuff. D3 is not really intended for 3D use, although you can use it for that. Like I said, it's mostly used with SVG, which is a flat sort of two-dimensional format. But a lot of people are doing experiments on using D3 to sort of load your data in, parse the data and everything, and then hand that data off to a WebGL library like 3JS or one of these other tools, even processing, the JavaScript version of processing. So you can start to do 3D things with that data, but you've had a little help with D3 loading it in. So it's really promising. The only thing is on iOS right now, it's not really feasible because Apple's not sort of supporting it in the native Safari browser. Oh, interesting.
Do we think that they are going to support it, or are they going to support a different format? I mean, because we know the history with Flash and what Apple did there.
Well, they support it in desktop Safari now. It came, sort of Chrome was the first to support WebGL, and then it came a little later in Safari and Firefox, and now, I guess the hope is they'll support it in mobile too. And
do you recommend anything else for 3D, or should we just stick with WebGL?
I think, as far as I know, WebGL is the only sort of 3D technology that works well in the browser. Your choices are really just sort of limited to what library you want to use. Most people don't want to write WebGL code directly because it's a total headache. So usually, I mentioned 3JS. Processing, I think, is used to support or is going to support 3D. There's some other libraries that I could look up and remember the names of later.
We can certainly put them in the post.
But yeah, so it's sort of more a question of which library is closely aligned with what you're trying to do.
And is there a resource for those libraries and where a web developer might go if they're looking for a solution?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Tony Parisi's book and his website, WebGL, he has a WebGL blog. I'm forgetting the name of it right now.
Right.
But so I think every week he posts, here's the most amazing things that happened this week in WebGL. And so it's, overwhelming to see all the demos and things that people can do with it now.
So are you seeing a lot of your work move to 3D, or are you primarily focused on two-dimensional work with visualizations, which, I mean, I'm assuming that there are reasons to do so, and certain applications are more effective in one format or another, correct?
Yeah, definitely. So visualization-wise, most of what I do tends to be sort of two-dimensional, but interactive. And I don't know, maybe partly because that's the technology that I tend to use, but it's also because perceptually three dimensions for visualization is really problematic, because our brains sort of can't make fair comparisons with objects in simulated 3D space the way that we can in actual two-dimensional space. So if I have a bar chart and I have a bar over here and I have a bar over here and they're both flat, it's really easy for me to make a comparison, see this is a bigger value than this value. But if I'm looking at this, say on like a 3D rotating globe and there's like different things going on and special effects, it's not really possible to make that fair comparison. So it looks really cool and you can do a lot of great demos, and there certainly are legitimate uses of visualization in 3D, like Tony showed in his talk yesterday, like a map of the arms trade, and it was shown on the 3D globe. So there are cases when it might be appropriate, but perceptually it's really hard to get sort of an accurate read on the data. It's better for sort of general big picture types of visualizations.
So as with anything in design, when there are more features and tools, it's often better to sit back and not just use everything because it's available. It's to think about the application.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the key things why the kind of key design principles are still really important, because it's not just about all the cool looking stuff you can make. I mean, if you're trying to just make a cool looking demo, that's great, you can make a cool looking demo. But if you're trying to actually communicate some information or tell a particular story with that data, you need to be able to make sure people can read it. Just like if you were writing a novel, if people aren't able to read your words because they don't make sense or there's too many typos, it's not going to be usable and nobody will sort of experience that novel. And I think in the same way, if your visualization isn't kind of calibrated to how people interpret images, how our brains work, then you might as well not have made it, because it will either just confuse them or they won't understand and they'll walk away.
Okay, all right. Well, some really good advice for developers. Well, thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you.